We welcome everybody. We welcome everybody who is here today. We're glad you came. The League of Women Voters runs these meetings once a month, the second Friday of each month. We used to do it at the Chocolate Cafe, but now we're doing it on Zoom from noon to 1. And we have speakers from government, from agencies, from the community to talk to us about what is going on in our community. And one of the things about the League of Women Voters is that it is a nonpartisan political organization, encouraging informed and active participation in government. And it influences public policy through education and advocacy. We never support or oppose any political party or candidate. We have two separate distinct roles. We have a voter service arm, which where we register voters and give voter information about elections and the voting process. And then we have an action and advocacy arm, where after study of an issue, we use our position that everyone has voted on to advocate for or against a particular policy in the public interest. So we'd like, excuse me, we'd like to ask you to remain muted while our speaker is speaking, and use the chat for any questions that you might have. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dalila Huerta is an educator and restorative justice consultant.
Excuse me just a minute, Melanie. Somebody has put a thing up that has shared it, and it doesn't need to be there. And I think it's Penny. Can you unshare, Penny? There, thank you. Go ahead, Melanie.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm introducing our speaker for today, Dalila Huerta, who is an educator and restorative justice consultant. She graduated from Goshen High School, from Marion College, and the university with a master's from the University of Delaware. She has worked in museums, community centers, and public schools with a focus on the intersections between art, history, and racial justice. Restorative justice ties together her love of storytelling and relationship building so that we can co-create a future where all can thrive. And with that, oh no, I need to just do a few little housekeeping things for the League. I'm sorry. There are 2 meetings left on public input about how to spend the $59 million from the American Rescue Plan. One of them is tonight at 6 p.m. at Pinhook Park, and the next one is August 17th at 6 p.m. at Howard Park. These are meetings that the city has asked people to come and give input on for how to spend $59 million in our community. And the League recommends that people go and voice their opinion, but they also are hoping that some people will recommend money for safe, sanitary, and affordable housing for the homeless and for low-income citizens, with wraparound services for all those who need that housing, and also transparency in decision-making. Those are all basic League principles. Also, we're going to have a fundraiser October 28th, 2021, so save the date. Okay, now back to Dalila. Thank you for letting me interrupt there for a minute, and you're on.
Thank you, Melanie, so much for that introduction, and to the League of Women Voters for inviting me here. And thank you all for making the time on a Friday to join us today. And so before I begin any presentation, I'm going to share my screen in just a second. But I also would like to invite us in a short land acknowledgement before we kick things off. So I'll present my screen here. As Melanie mentioned, you're welcome to add any questions that you have throughout in the chat. I probably won't get to them until the end unless there's any pressing matter that I need to address immediately. Let me know, and then I'll do my best to address it. So as I mentioned before we begin, I just want to invite everybody to just pause for a moment and reflect on whose ancestral home you are currently residing in. And then also to think about the circumstances that brought you to this moment and this place. How are you carrying your ancestors with you today? I have the name of my consulting business at the bottom, which is named Cempasúchil Cultural Equity Work. Cempasúchil is the Spanish word for the marigold. And if anybody has seen Coco or is familiar with Day of the Dead practices, the marigold is the flower that we use to decorate our altars and to call back the ancestors to this work. And so all of the work that I do is deeply embedded to ancestors that came before me. So I do want to make sure that we take some time just to acknowledge and to welcome that presence with us here today. And so I'll give a little bit of my own land acknowledgement. So today, I find myself living on the ancestral lands of many different indigenous cultures, but in particular, the ancestral home of the Pokagon band of the Potawatomi. And this is a culture that is still very much present in this community today. My parents, however, emigrated from a different motherland, still on the same continent, but they came from the Purepecha lands in what we now call Michoacan, Mexico. And they settled separately, so they came individually and settled in a different Midwestern city, which we now call Chicago. That's where they met, they got married, they started their family, that's where I was born. And I grew up in a neighborhood, a Mexican-American neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen. And so I like to start with my family's history because it reminds me of the migration patterns of monarch butterflies. And I like to start with this because one of the largest monarch habitats happens to be in my parents' home state of Michoacan. And this trajectory is very similar to the one that they followed as well. So they came from Michoacan here to the Midwest. We haven't quite made it all the way up to Canada, except for just like a short little trip, but my son does say that he has a deep desire to move to Canada one day. So maybe he'll follow along in these footsteps and become a monarch and go a little bit further than we did. But I like to talk about this story here because monarchs are really fascinating creatures. I know we've seen these, like thousands, millions of butterflies that make this really long trajectory throughout the continent. And I was curious because I didn't know this, but it isn't like one generation of butterflies that goes all the way up and then returns. So it's multiple generations. So the ones that return eventually back to Mexico aren't the original monarchs that left. It's like the fourth or fifth generation that goes back. And so I love this because, it shows that power of ancestry and returning to your roots. And so I really love the story of monarchs. But the other reason that I wanted to start with monarchs is because I think they're just such a beautiful symbol of both the interconnectedness of them. So it's, this huge swarm of butterflies that are traveling together and returning to their ancestral home. So there is that interconnected between them. And because they're also just a wonderful symbol of transformation. And that's what we're going to be talking about, because these two are fundamental tenets of restorative justice, interconnectedness and transformation. And I hope that that theme carries throughout my presentation today. So for me, I'll just share this. There are lots of different definitions for restorative justice, lots of different interpretations. So I do want to say that what I say is my own understanding of restorative justice, and the definition of restorative justice that I've come to understand, along with the really wide community of RJ practitioners here in South Bend. And I especially want to call out two people, Susan Sharp, who retired last year from the University of Notre Dame, and Kathy Streeter, who is the Restorative Justice Coordinator for South Bend Schools. These are two of my biggest mentors and deep friends who have helped me come to this work. And I know that I wouldn't be doing this work without them. So I consider them my ancestors as well, even though we're not actually related, but they do shape my philosophy and understanding of restorative justice. And so for me, in my definition, as we've come to develop along with the other RJ practitioners here in South Bend, we understand restorative justice as an invitation to respond to harm through relational accountability. And I'm going to dive a little deeper into this definition as we go. But as a part of restorative justice, we're always encouraged to share stories and our personal truths. So we get to this relational accountability, which means, that we have an obligation to each other, which we understand through the building of relationships. We get to that point by sharing stories. And so I want to go back to my story and how I came to this work in order for me to share what restorative justice means to me, and also to share the wider implications of restorative justice here in South Bend. So as I mentioned, my parents emigrated individually from Mexico, and they started their family in Pilsen. So this is a picture of some of the murals that adorn the streets of Pilsen in Chicago. So this is a Mexican-American neighborhood in the heart of the city, really rich, like lots of excellent food. I saw myself represented everywhere that I went. I grew up speaking Spanish. You may have noticed, Melanie used my name in Spanish, so Dalila. I grew up speaking Spanish at home. I learned English in school. I was surrounded with images and representations of myself, and not, these one-dimensional monolithic representations, but we were just allowed to be who we were. And it was just a really rich and inviting and warm culture that surrounded me. At the same time, however, this was a neighborhood that was largely ignored by the city, was poorly funded. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of violence that plagued our streets. We were often attacked by gangs. Both of my brothers actually ended up going to prison during the time that we lived in Chicago. So I always lived this weird duality of feeling really warm and welcomed and just really happy in my community, and really thriving in school, right? So having teachers who loved me and who really did love me, and I don't exaggerate when I use that word, right? Who loved and nurtured me in school. But then spending weekends visiting my brothers in prison downstate and being strip searched every other weekend. And being seen as a suspect, and just seeing my dignity being violated, while at the same time feeling amazing in this neighborhood, right? So I grew up feeling both of those senses of understanding what a rich community was, but then also understanding how the rest of the world saw me. And I don't think that it really hit me until we left Pilsen just how differently the world saw me, because that's when I lost this rich environment. So again, right, I was still seeing injustice here. I saw my dignity being violated on a regular occurrence. But once that rich, nurturing community left, I had nothing except this negative violation of dignity in my life. And so in the middle of 8th grade, my father lost his job and we were forced to move. And so we left and we settled in Goshen, Indiana. So this was before I went to high school, before I met Melanie. She was actually my French teacher in high school. But before I had wonderful teachers like Melanie in high school, I had a really heartbreaking experience in Goshen. And I remember the first day that I went to school to register for class. This was, Goshen, if you don't know Goshen, right? It's a small town. And at this time, this was 2000, at this time, they were seeing a huge influx of recent immigrants from Mexico and from other places in Central America. And so they saw me, I went with my mother to register. And the first thing that the administrator told me was, "Oh, another one." And so again, right, I had experienced discrimination and I witnessed violence and I saw oppression before in my life. But up until this point, school had been a haven for me, right? I loved going to school. I loved escaping from my reality. I loved my relationship with my classmates and my teachers. Here's some other photos of our time from Chicago. So you see me, I'm there and wearing this really unfortunate, 1990s outfit, the sweater with the gold lame skirt here. Loved it. 90s were great. So I had a lovely time in school. I loved it. We were happy. I had friends, I had shared culture with them. But when I went to Goshen, all of that was completely invalidated. And so the message that I received when I went to Goshen to register, this was Goshen Middle School, was that I wasn't welcome, that there was a part of me, right, a part of my whole self that was unwelcome, that was unworthy to be in school. And I really struggled that year in 8th grade. They didn't look at my transcripts. At this point, I was in algebra, I was in honors English, I was a straight A student doing really well in school. And they put me in remedial English, they put me in pre-algebra, never looked at my classes, never looked at my I-STEP scores or whatever we used to call them back then in Illinois. Didn't look at any of that, but just made a bunch of assumptions about me based on how I looked. And for almost 13-year-old child, right, that was devastating because again, school for me was my refuge. And it was really hard for me, my parents not knowing the language, right, not knowing how the systems worked. It was really hard for them to get things straight. And it's something that they shouldn't have had to do because they should have seen me as an individual and treated me with respect. Eventually, they were able to sort it out and got me placed into the classes that I needed to be. I went on to high school and I had a vastly different experience in high school, largely in part because of the teachers and mentors that I had there. And so I don't want to make it seem like, I had this event and then everything went downhill. But it did shift the way that I understood the world at this point. Because through this incident, and again, it was the actions of one man, but the whole system allowed it to happen. And that's what I realized then, right? That it is really easy to allow our systems to cause harm to other people, right? It is really easy for one person to make that judgment, that assumption, and have the system willingly participate in it, right? And I recognized then this gross violation of my dignity in a place that was supposed to feel safe for me. And I also realized that there was this just society-wide unacceptance of who I was as an individual, right? My whole self was not enough and wasn't welcomed in this space. And so at this moment, I had this deep desire to retreat from this place, right? Like I literally refused to go to school for a week after this happened. And again, straight A student, I always loved to go to school. And here I was literally refusing to get out of bed to go to school. There was this deep desire to retreat from community, but at the same time, I realized that I needed other people to feel whole. I desperately missed that community that I used to have in Chicago that I didn't have here. But I think that this process helped me understand that, yes, we are interconnected, that we do need each other. And that this incident that happened, while it violated my dignity, I also needed other people to repair that harm, right? I couldn't do that on my own. I couldn't just go away and fix it on my own and then just be okay on my own. I knew that I needed other people. And as I grew up, I studied history. I looked at, how we got to this place. I was always fascinated by stories of people. And what I began to understand through my work in history and then eventually my work in restorative justice is that this interconnectedness that I sense there is actually a biological need that we all have. Like we are literally neurologically wired to need other people. And I think, after becoming a mother, noticing how, a child needs that relationship with another human being to understand their place in the world, right? That sense of belonging, that sense of safety, that they do become more courageous and they want to try and to learn new things if they have that sense of safety in their world. All of these things help me to understand that there is this innate need that we have to be in good relation with one another. And so because of this interdependence, right, I think we can assume that we need each other in order to thrive. Like, yes, I can go off and be successful on my own and be, detached from everybody else. But in order for me to truly thrive, right, and I think thrive is a little bit different than success, but to actually thrive, to be my whole self to the fullest capacity, I need other people. And other people need me. And because we need each other, then we also have obligations to one another. And ultimately, that obligation is to respect each other's dignity. And so when we don't respect each other's dignity, this is what we call injustice. So in the restorative justice world, injustice is defined as a violation of dignity. And that's what I had experienced, right? In my experience in Goshen, when I went to visit my brothers in prison, right? All of that was a violation of my dignity. It was a message that the person in front of me didn't see me as human, that didn't respect my humanity. and then didn't see me as a whole person with very specific needs, right? And so this is what injustice is. And yes, this was a personal experience that I experienced, right? And there was pain and trauma related to that. But there's also a lot of other larger societal impacts to this type of injustice. And so I'm going to just share quickly from a wonderful author and a practitioner of restorative justice in New York. Her name is Danielle Sered. She actually also lived in Chicago for a while, but now has a practice called Common Justice in New York that works with people who are facing felonies and using restorative processes there to repair some of the harm that has been caused. And so in her book, Until We Reckon, she outlined some of the causes of violence. And, again, she's dealing with felonies, right? So grand, on a grand scale, right? Harm of a grand scale. But she outlined some of the causes of violence in our community. And so she names these 4 things. So shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so these are the drivers of violence. And I know we've, here in South Bend, we talk a lot about, the increasing violence that we see every day, right? We read reports of shootings and robberies and all of this violence that is happening. And we always ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Well, the answer is right here in front of us, because these are the causes of violence, right? And these have been studied, throughout the world. These are ultimately, right, all of these different reasons go down to these 4 root causes: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and inability to meet economic needs. And if you notice that all of these are also related to dignity, right? So when you shame somebody, when you make them feel like they're not a part of your society, when you isolate them, when they see that violence every day, right, that attack on humanity, and when you don't give them the ability to meet those basic needs. So thank you, Melanie, when you were talking about, the current budget conversations, right? We're encouraging people to go to demand, right, that people receive those basic needs. Because when they don't have those basic needs met, this can often result into cycles of violence. And so once violence happens, you'll notice, the 3rd one is exposure to violence. If you witness violence, right, you're more likely to be to commit violence later on in your life. And so all of these things are, again, related to dignity and how we can be in good relation with each other. And so there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are many definitions of restorative justice and many ways to practice it. But at the core of these understandings of restorative justice is the basic understanding that justice in this case is putting things right. And what we're putting things right are all of those different causes that we just listed. How can we fix those so that we can be in a right relation with each other? And so when I mention right relation, right, what I mean is essentially respecting each other's dignity, having mutual concern, and having shared power. And so justice is not necessarily about laws or punishing people when they break laws or rules, but rather about relationships. So if you have violated somebody's dignity, if you have neglected your obligation to others, what must be done to right this wrong, right? Who has been harmed? What obligations exist now because of that harm? And what needs to happen now in order to fix this wrong? And so to continue on Danielle Sered and how she defines what she calls doing sorry, which means putting things right. We are called then to acknowledge responsibility for our harmful actions, when we hurt another person. We also need to acknowledge the impact of our actions, right? I think I hope that we've heard now, the differences between intent versus impact, right? So like maybe, we weren't intending to cause this severe harm, but we have to acknowledge that our actions do have an impact. And that is where the harm is, right? How do we address the impact of our actions? We should express genuine remorse for our harmful actions, but that's not enough, right? It's not enough to say sorry if it's not actually fixing things. So it always results in this accountability. Accountability is a key word in restorative justice, right? That we must take action to repair that harm, and when as feasible as possible, to include the people who have been harmed in helping us decide what that accountability should look like. So let's say that I hurt Melanie, And I decide, okay, I am going to send her flowers as a way to repair that harm. Well, let's say that she doesn't like flowers, or maybe she's allergic to flowers, or maybe she feels like this is completely bypassing the actual harm that I committed, right? Because I'm not including her in the process, my action is meaningless. So a process in which all stakeholders, everybody who's directly impacted by that harm, come together to decide what is the best and proper way of repairing this harm, that is essential, right? So everybody's involved. And last but not least, it also requires transforming the conditions that to prevent this harm from happening again. So from this definition of justice, putting things right, we like to expand upon it by saying that justice is also disrupting and transforming the conditions of injustice. Because again, when we look back to some of those root causes of violence and harm, all of those, many of those are systemic issues, right? That require systemic answers. So if we're looking to transform violence and harm in our community, then we also need to transform the conditions that allow for that harm to happen. And so that's what restorative justice invites us to do. And so I don't view restorative justice as an alternative to incarceration or to the traditional criminal legal system. I see it as a best practice for us being in community together, because we need to have these huge investment in time and practice to develop the skills we need in order to do what I just outlined, right? Coming together, determining what that accountability looks like, expressing remorse. All of those things require the development of skills that we often don't give time to, right? We live in a society, and I think that this was quite evident during the pandemic, a highly individualistic society, right? Where we care about ourselves and we don't take time to build that community and build those obligations to one another. And so this deep need for building these skills and practices to reach these skills asks us to commit to several things. So when we practice being in community together, again, we're making sure that we're respecting the dignity of each other. We're exercising shared power, which I think is crucial, especially for institutions, especially when we're talking about issues of race and white supremacy. What does it look like to share power with other people? Because oftentimes that means giving up some of the power that you have historically held, right? And it doesn't mean that you're giving up all your power, because it means you're sharing power. But even that can be a tall order for many folks. And it also means developing mutual concern, which again, against our very capitalistic nature, right? That our success is rooted in what we as an individual should do. This is calling us to develop mutual concern to do what is good for the common good, not the individual good, but for the common good. And so I wanted to share a few stories of restorative justice happening here in South Bend as illustrations of how restorative justice can happen. Because I mentioned, restorative justice looks many different ways, and it oftentimes is determined by the stakeholders themselves. But one of the common practices of restorative justice is coming together in circle, which is one of my favorite things in the world, just being a circle keeper and tending a circle for various different needs. But coming together in circle, and I hope that you'll all have a chance to experience a circle at some point throughout your life. We have several throughout the community. But coming together in circle helps us exercise these three things and a couple of others like inclusion, equity, all of these other wonderful values that are necessary for restorative justice. And so I'll share three stories of circles that I've led recently. I'll begin with one that I worked with at a faculty from IU South Bend. And so this was a group of from the College of Nursing Sciences. And so we had, so again, this was during the pandemic. So I don't think I even have to explain the tremendous strain that they were feeling during the pandemic, right? Being educators to future nurses. And so on top of that, they were also dealing with a lot of personal losses. Several of their faculty had passed away in the past year. They also just had a lot of personal family trauma that was happening and that they were bringing with them every day to work. And so I was able to do 3 circles with them. The one that I wanted to share was this healing circle that we used at the beginning to come together to commemorate some of the people that had passed away. And so the image that you see here on the right is a paper tapestry that we made commemorating some of the people that had passed away. The warp, so the ones that go up and down of the tapestry, they're all values that they learned from the people who had passed away. So things like love and integrity, and we shared stories about those things. And we saw that, you know, we all had different interpretations of these words, but the power and the universality of some of these values was very evident. And then we also wrote short stories along the left, so the ones that go from left to right, about the people who had touched their lives, things that also just help them remember, bring joy into their lives as well. And so they hang these in their offices as a memory of the people that had passed away. But as much as, you know, individually it was great for everybody to share those stories of their own personal pain and trauma, I think what really helped, you know, I received a note later on just about how it had just relieved some of the tensions among them, right? Because they were coming to work carrying all this pain and trauma and oftentimes taking it out on each other, right? This ability to understand, like, oh, this is what you're going through right now. And to give themselves time, right, to just slow down for 2 hours, to just share and to sit with some of these stories was so powerful for this group. And we had 2 other circles, and it was just like really wonderful because it's like, yes, this is our circle time. You know, they would shut off their phones and close their laptops, and they just wanted to be present with each other because they didn't have this chance to be with each other like this very often. And so this is an example of how we can build those interpersonal relationships by giving ourselves the ability to come together to share some of those stories that we often don't share with each other. The other story that I want to share comes from a recent, this is the centerpiece from our most recent circle keeping training that we led with South Bend Schools. And in this training, we had a lot of teachers, we had administrators. It was just 4 days, right, of how to be a circle keeper and what are some of those foundations of restorative justice. And what I really loved about this was, again, this is after the pandemic, after a year of e-learning and hybrid learning and a bunch of stuff, and right before the school year. This was literally 2 weeks before the school year began. But it was really evident some of the harm that we are causing in our schools. And oftentimes when we present restorative justice as something that's done to children, or we present restorative justice as like a simple conflict resolution model, right? So if there's an issue with your students, you plop them in a circle and you let them talk it out and let them fix it, and that's it. And that's so not what restorative justice is. And what we were hearing from a lot of the teachers was some of their feelings of feeling neglected, feeling ignored, that they were being called to do something for their students, to support them, when they weren't feeling that support themselves. And it was this really powerful moment of seeing teachers and administrators come together to understand that restorative justice isn't a program that you implement just for, you know, students, or just for people who have high needs, or just when there's conflict. That restorative justice is a larger call for systemic change, for implementing an entire restorative culture within the entire organization where everybody feels that their dignity is being respected. And the last story I want to share is from a series of circles that I was actually able to do with Goshen Community Schools. So I did them last year as they were launching their Equity and Inclusion Council. And so I was able to do 3 circles with them as they're trying to really confront some of their legacy with discrimination and inequity in their schools. And for those of you who don't know, you know, Goshen has been a sundown town in the past, which meant that, you know, Black people were not welcome in this town. And so how do they reckon with that history? How do they establish this inclusion within their schools? What do they look at? How do they define inclusion? And oftentimes we have this incorrect assumption that inclusion just means inviting somebody to your table, right? But you still hold all the power on shaping what that table is going to look like. But true inclusion should lead to an actual sense of belonging, which means that everybody at that table owns the table. Everybody at the table gets to determine what's served. And so how do we create this culture of belonging within our systems? And what do we look at? And so it was really powerful to see all sorts of members from the community, from different levels at the school, so from staff and teachers to administrators coming together to talk about what this vision of inclusion for their schools could look like. And for me, it was really powerful, right, to be able to return to Goshen schools, to share my story of what had happened, right, in the past. But then to be able to see, you know, what is this new promise of what can happen, what we can build together. And so I wanted to share those 3 stories to see how we can respond to both interpersonal harms, so those, you know, harms that happen between individuals, systemic harms when we're looking at an entire culture, and historical harms, right? How do we reckon with the past histories of racism and injustice and violations, gross violations of dignity on a larger scale? And restorative justice can provide this pathway because it models on how we can respect each other's dignities, both interpersonally, but then again, also larger through policy and through other systems. And so I want to be mindful of time, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to get to some questions. But I wanted to leave us with one of my favorite readings by Robin Wallkimmer. She's a Potawatomi botanist, and she wrote a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And I share this reading as much as I can. I like to joke that I want to grow up to be a pecan tree. And I hope you'll understand once I share the reading, because it is about pecan trees. So this is my ultimate life goal, right? To become a pecan tree. And so I'll end with this reading. So like us, pecan trees appear to be independent beings. Robin Wallkimmer says that we might assume that the production of a tree's nut crop would depend on the fertility of the soil under it, or how sheltered it was from rain or sun. She says, if this were true, each tree would fruit on its own schedule, predictable by the size of its reserves of stored starch. But they don't. If one tree fruits, they all fruit. There are no soloists, not one tree in a grove, but the whole grove. Not one grove in the forest, but every grove, all across the county and all across the state. The trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. Exactly how they do this, we don't yet know, but what we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. We can all starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. And so I love ending with this reading because I firmly believe in that last statement, right? That what happens to one happens to us all. We can all starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. And in the midst of all of this pain and tragedy that we still see, right? I think restorative justice calls us to come together to understand that this flourishing is mutual, right? That resources may be limited, but they're enough for all of us here if we do have that courage and commitment to coming together to take care of each other. And so to me, you know, the pecan tree is just this beautiful representation. And I wanted to dig a little bit more into how this happens. So they actually do something called masting, where they're literally like talking to each other. These trees come together, they talk to each other to determine whether it's time to fruit or not. And they do this probably because of this evolutionary development that they have, that they want to produce all at the same time so that they have an abundance of fruit, so that if animals come and eat some, there are still enough to seed and grow into other pecan trees, right? So they're coming together for the collective good, which I think is just such a wonderful model for us all, especially, right, coming still in the middle of this pandemic, still reckoning with our long history of racism in this country, looking at the ecological devastation that's happening across the world. How can we come together to ensure not only our survival, but how we thrive together? And so with that, I'll end my presentation, and I will gladly take any questions or comments from the chat. So thank you all. So let's see. Thanks, April, for, yes, I love Kimmer's book. It's really wonderful. Yes, so the book is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wallkimmer, and I can type that into the chat.
I have a question, Dalila.
Yes.
This is Ronaldo. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. There's an issue that is very much at the forefront in parts of our community about school resource officers. How do you see restorative justice as relating to the issue of police resource officers?
So I'll mention that I don't see restorative justice as an alternative to police and schools, because I feel like that is the wrong answer to a wrong question. So it's not so much about asking ourselves, do cops belong in schools? The question should be different. I always approach this work with the question of, what do our children need to thrive? What does our community need to thrive? And I think in this conversation, we need to reckon with the fact that police were literally put into our schools as a response to desegregation. That was literally when they came into our schools. And I think we also need to ask our question, what is the purpose of police in schools? And come together as a community to understand what that is. And if we have this purpose for them, are they actually accomplishing that goal? Because if they're put in schools, which we know they were put in schools in response to desegregation, because now we were seeing the threat of Black students in schools. That was the rationale for having police officers in schools, to protect white students. And this is across the nation, but especially here in South Bend, that's when they were called in to our schools. So if we're trying to create safe spaces for our students, are police the best way to go? And so I think we need to answer that question first. Restorative justice should be something that happens in our schools all the time. Remember that this is about establishing restorative cultures in schools. Personally, I think that having somebody with a weapon who can take away my dignity, to take away my life, I don't understand how we can create a restorative culture with the presence of guns in school. But again, that is a conversation that needs to be happening community-wide. And the focus really needs to be on, how are we creating places in our schools where students can thrive, where teachers can thrive, where families can thrive? I think that's the question that needs to be asked.
Well, you know, I agree with the objectives, but what I'm concerned about here is the school to prison pipeline, and how school police officers have a reputation for contributing to that. Restorative justice has quite a different kind of objective. If anything, I would dare say that it is a way of keeping kids out of that pipeline. And while I don't necessarily disagree with the role of police in providing basic safety and protecting kids from violence, but that the school police officers are not trained to deal with the violence that is being done to our kids, not just in a, if they are directed into a situation where they have to deal with the school resource officer, but also the violence that they're already experiencing in the classroom. When a kid is sent out of the room and is put under the authority of a police resource officer, it's because the order of the classroom has been disrupted and the teacher can't teach. But there is a flip side to the equation, because it fails to consider that not only can the teacher not teach under these circumstances, but the student can't learn under these circumstances. So, somehow the restorative justice system has to be part and parcel of restoring order in the classroom, whether the police are involved in that or not. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with anything that you mentioned. It's just that restorative justice should not be used as a way to restore order in the classroom, at least not from my view of restorative justice. It's a way to build community and to address the underlying needs so that when there are actions or disruptions in the classroom, we're able to understand and address those needs of the child or the adult in whatever situation is happening. Because an underlying tenet of restorative justice is that nobody is disposable, right? So we're not going to just completely eliminate a student and completely reject a student based on those actions, but how can we get to the core of the matter in addressing those needs of each student? And so certainly I see restorative justice as addressing some of the issues of the school to prison pipeline. But I think again that, when we're talking about cops in schools, they're literally there to protect law and order, like that is their job, that is their mission. Where restorative justice is about repairing relationships. So again, they're coming at our situations in school from vastly different directions. So I think that they're looking at it from a completely different lens that oftentimes are competing with each other. And let's see.
I still see some links in this whole complex of concepts that we're talking about. Granted, a police officer might be needed to restore order in the classroom, but that doesn't restore relationships. And that's what I'm talking about. I said the role of restorative justice in restoring the relationships that have been harmed because of the disruptive action of the students and the non-restorative removal of the kid from the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I am going to take just a couple of other questions since we're short on time here. So here's a question from Elizabeth. So how do we get ourselves, our friends, our neighbors, and the institutions with which we are associated to begin to practice restorative justice? What do you recommend? Where shall we start? After asking ourselves if we are ready to respect the dignity of each person, to share power, and to develop mutual concern for the common good. So thank you for that question, Elizabeth. I am going to share two things. So one, I think Kathy Streeter is on this call. Yes, she is. So Kathy Streeter is the RJ coordinator for South Bend Schools. We have regular RJ trainings with the district, which is open to community members. So if you're interested in learning more about restorative justice, becoming a circle keeper, learning more about this work and how to bring this work to your organization, you are always welcome to reach out and join in some of our trainings. We've had wonderful people from St. Margaret's House, from Big Brother, Big Sister, Civil Rights Heritage Center, participate in some of these trainings to bring it back to their institutions. So please definitely reach out in order to take those trainings. I'll just share a couple of the resources that I really love. If you're looking to get a brief understanding, there's a wonderful series from Living Justice Press. They're called The Little Books of, and then there's a bunch of books in different topics. There's a little book of restorative justice. There's a little book of restorative justice in education. There's a little book of race and restorative justice, which I think is an excellent place to begin. All of these are wonderful resources. They're really short, really accessible. So I definitely encourage you to look at that. And I see that Deborah Stanley is here too. Deborah Stanley has been practicing restorative justice in this community for a really long time. So thank you, Deborah, and Imani Unidad, her organization. I'll also mention, since I see a lot of folks here from our dedicated RJ group, We do have a group of RJ practitioners here in South Bend with the hope of creating a restorative justice hub to support our community. So I hope, I think it's still too early to explain and go too in depth about what we hope to do, but hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to launch in an official capacity a group of restorative justice practitioners in the community here to support restorative justice work citywide. And then let's see, so just a short story here. So I had very same experience when I brought my son to kindergarten. The first day of school, everyone involved was white. Please speak to personal hurts compared to restorative justice issues. So I think I need just a little bit more information on what you would like me to speak on. Because I think restorative justice speaks to both, right? So some of that interpersonal conflict or harm that happens between individuals, but then also some of those systemic issues. But I think in both, what we're doing is bringing the stakeholders together to understand. Yeah, so it's not necessarily, so I appreciate that you mentioned that. Yeah, so we can get all, insulted. And so, but you can still be restorative in how you approach it. So restorative justice is both on an individual level, but also on a systemic level, because all of them, again, are violations of dignity. But coming together, having that conversation with each other in a way that's respectful to each other's dignity is still restorative justice, right? But again, you can also look at it more systemically, more historically, and applying the same process on a wider scale. And thank you, Kathy, for sharing your email. And thank you for being here, Kathy. And thank you, George, for sharing. Yes, so there's a link for the little books on here as well. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything here. Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth, for that comment as well. Yes, so all about action. So absolutely disrupting and transforming the root causes of injustice. Thank you, Elizabeth. And let's see. Oh, I missed this one from Barb earlier. My consulting thing is just me. So I do circles with the people that I have built relationships with. I also work closely with the South Bend School Corporation, with Kathy, Stuart Green, Deborah, Ellen Williams. So we regularly do training there. Me personally, I have not had much work with the criminal legal system. So I like using the term criminal legal system, since there isn't a lot of justice in our criminal legal system. And so the hope is that we would be able to expand this work to work within the criminal legal system as well. And there are lots of different models that can be used, whether it's, a diversion program that happens after sentencing. And so, when they're sentenced, they have the option of participating in an RJ program or getting a more traditional criminal sentencing. There's also programs, that work, specifically with youth to help them avoid getting into the criminal legal system. And then there are also more community-based ones where when there is harm or violence that happens in the community itself goes to the group to help repair that harm that has happened. So it kind of bypasses the criminal legal system entirely. So there are different models. So again, I personally don't work within the criminal legal system or do that work. And so I am really drawn more to sort of the community building preventative work that happens to build those relationships in the first place. And then I think this question is for the League of Women Voters. So the meeting you mentioned at Pinhook Park this evening, can you give more information? I think this is the one for the budget.
Yes, that's what I think Jane is talking about. Before I answer Jane, I just wanted to ask you, Dalila, about I'm not sure what you were responding to in the chat, but about, is there an organization? Is there a group that people can go to? Is there a website or besides your email address or Kathy Streeter's address, is there a place where, if a community group wanted to go and use restorative justice, is there a place where people can go and find that service?
Hopefully not yet, and that's what we're trying to work on and establishing here. So as of right now, we're individuals. So again, me, Kathy, Deborah Stanley, any one of us can help with those issues as they arise. But the hope is that we would create a restorative justice resource hub here in South Bend where people can turn to for those needs.
Okay, that's what I thought you were saying, but I just wanted to be sure. Are there any other questions for Dalila before I go back to the League of Women Voters? We can't hear you, Pam.
Unmuted.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. You said so much to, we're in the group for the advocacy for the unsheltered folks in town. And everything you said was right on target with what we need to hear. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the invitation.
I want to thank you too, Dalila. Thank you for coming and speaking. It was inspirational. And there was a question about the meeting tonight and the meeting on August 17th. The city of South Bend has been planning these events to gather public input on how to spend $59 million from the American Rescue Plan, which is federal COVID relief and stimulus money. And I have heard from one person who went to one of these meetings that when you go, you are given monopoly money and you can place your monopoly money on whatever. There are many different ways that or suggestions that have been made on how to spend $59 million. And you can put your monopoly money on wherever you talk in a group, and you can put it wherever you would like to put it. And so there also is a online, you can do it online if you can't go to the meeting. And I don't know the link to do that, but I think you probably can find it if you go on the city's website.
Excuse me, this is Deb Riley.
Yes.
The meeting at Pinhook was last night.
August 12th.
The final meeting that
You're
we
right.
have.
I'm sorry.
I'm a facilitator. That's how come I know. The final meeting is Tuesday at 6 o'clock at Howard Park.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for correcting that bit of misinformation. So we only have one more chance, in other words, to give input. And so the league is recommending that the league committee on those experiencing homelessness, and housing is one of the four major things that the money can be used for. And so we were hoping that some people, if they felt inspired to do so, would recommend that safe, sanitary, and affordable housing for low-income citizens and those experiencing homelessness, and wraparound services for all of those needing housing would be one of the recommendations, and also transparency in the decision-making and collaboration between the county, the city, and agencies and community organizations, because those are basic tenets of the league. So is that enough information? Enough correct information? Corrected? Thank you again, Deborah. Did we answer the question? Okay, I think that we've come up on our time. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you to Dalila for that wonderful inspirational talk, and lots of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and come back next month. We will have another speaker
Oh.
on the second Friday of the month.
And it's from the library about
Thank you all.
everything that's happening at the library next month.
Do you want me to hang out to debrief anything, or
No,
we're done?
I
We're
just
good.
want to say it was great. It's kind of different from many of our talks before, but it's a way of approaching